Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, December 15th, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2024 electoral map and talk about my initial ratings for some of these states. Now, I know it seems like this is a very far away election, but after the 2016 election, we had a general idea of where the Democratic Party would be targeting their states for the upcoming election, and we have a general idea of which political parties are going to be focusing on certain states in future elections as well, especially this upcoming election. So we were making videos back in early 2017, mid 2017. That's when I began my channel. So I think it's fine to discuss 2024. I know many of you guys are tired of hearing about a presidential election, but actually I think this is a well-needed break from the discussion of the 2020 election because I do want to focus on analysis about what happens after the election, especially the 2021, the 2021 Georgia runoff elections. I'm going to be actually making a video on those this evening because we have some interesting numbers out of the first day of voting there. But today, or this video, we're going to be focusing on 2024 and pretty much taking it and diving deep into it, talking about potential nominees and just talking about some of these ratings that I think the states are certainly going to be classified almost immediately by political pundits. So when you're looking at the electoral map, one thing is pretty different: the number of electors for each state. Now, your state may be the same. My state did not change based off of its electoral projection, but this is based off of the projected electoral change following the 2020 census. So I'm sure many of you guys know what the census is. Every 10 years we take a census. We get a general population for each state, and that's how we pretty much well, first of all, it's for governmental data, but for the Electoral College, that's how we allocate the amount of electoral votes for a certain state. So we've actually seen some trends. The Rust Belt region has lost electoral votes. When Obama was first elected, Illinois and Pennsylvania had 21 electoral votes. Ohio had 20. Following this year's census, we could see it drop to 17 in Ohio, 19 in Pennsylvania and Illinois. It's actually been Illinois and Pennsylvania now, currently, for the 2020 electoral map, were 20 electoral votes. Ohio was 18. Michigan was 16. Minnesota was 10. So this entire area, we've seen a decrease in electoral presence, and we've seen an increase in the entire Sun Belt region. North Carolina gains 1, Florida gains 2, Texas gains 3, Colorado gains 1, Arizona gains 1. So this entire region, we are seeing pretty much an increase in terms of electoral representation. So what does this mean? Well, first things first, when there is increased population, that will traditionally help the Democratic Party. A lot of these rural states with very small populations are very conservative. And when we're looking at the areas that we see increased population, it's not amongst, rural areas in the specific state. We're seeing Atlanta metro area booming. We're seeing major cities in Florida, in Texas, around the country booming in terms of their population. So that in turn is going to help the Democratic Party. But don't get me wrong. Many of these states are going to be characterized the same way they have been in the past. They are going to be initially safe for the Republican Party unless the Democratic Party does try to contest them in one way or another. But what I see is actually a decrease in Republican support in some of these more traditional Republican states. I know that in 2020, we were expecting some of these more traditional Republican states to not vote for President Trump by such a large margin, but they did, but they were still narrowly, down to being likely states. And I think with increased minority populations around the entire country, that will help the Democratic Party. You cannot tell me that minority voters do not split for the Democratic Party heavily. The only reason why this country is still competitive for the Republican Party based off where they currently stand is because of white voters. If we had removed them entirely from the electorate in a hypothetical situation, not saying that's at all fair, but in a hypothetical situation, we would have Democrats winning all 538 electoral votes every election. So the reason why we have competitive elections is because pretty much white voters, which are the overwhelming majority of the electorate, 67% in a high minority turnout election, 70% traditionally, that's why our elections are competitive. And not to say that every voter in the white demographic group is voting for Republicans, but it's much higher in terms of percent than any other minority group or any minority group. Sorry. So looking at this map, we have our initial ratings based off the states that are probably going to be considered safe. Now, we could see some states such as New Jersey and Delaware and Connecticut return to being 13, 14-point victories for the Democratic Party. If you look back at 2016, you look at New Jersey, Hillary Clinton won it, but it was by 14 points. In Connecticut, she also won the state, but not by 15 plus. In Delaware, she won it by roughly 11 points. So this state, these states, could be likely in the future, but looking at this election, and it could be because Joe Biden was from Delaware, but he did very well there. He did very well in New Jersey. He did very well in the state of Connecticut. So looking at this map, I wouldn't say that these states are automatically going to be likely, but I think that they have the possibility of being so. So I'm going to say, if I was to rate it now, I would assume likely, because I don't think that the Democratic nominee in 2024 would be focused on really appealing to the Northeast as much as they could be. But I think that these states could arguably be safe. I'm actually, debating whether or not, but I'm saying when you see these likely ratings, don't freak out. We're talking 13, 14-point margins of victory, not really super competitive, but we have seen these states be decided by these margins in the past, and I think that's how it would move forward in 2024. Same thing for the Republican Party. I can't imagine that they'd be holding on to Missouri, Indiana, Montana, Alaska in specific, getting competitive. It was a single-digit victory for President Trump in this race, in this election, so that's fascinating. But looking at the states of Montana, Missouri, and Indiana, I think that looking at 2024, we could see some type of shift that's enough to move this state just 1 to 2 points less. I mean, looking at the margin, Donald Trump absolutely obliterated Biden, but just 0.5 lower, and this state would have been likely. In Indiana, 1.1% lower would have been likely, 1.4% lower in Montana, and Montana's actually expected to grow in terms of its electoral representation. Missouri and Indiana are not. So with, like I said, increased population, we could be seeing some type of shift. Really all depends on the nominee, but my initial rating is that Montana, Missouri, Indiana are likely. I think Kansas will also be a likely state for whatever reason. The state was a likely state this election, won by Trump by 14.7%. Not many people expected it. I said that it was going to be likely, but not many people agreed with me. It shifted by 6 points to the Democratic Party. So this state surprisingly has shown us a very interesting result, but I think that it could be likely in 2024. Likely states include Virginia, New Mexico, and Colorado. I called this state a stronghold in one of my more recent videos, and that is true. This state is going to be a very strong state for the Democratic Party. In fact, Colorado went more for Biden than a number of other states. Alaska, South Carolina. Actually, so Alaska was 10.1%. It wasn't single digits, but Colorado went more for Biden than Trump won in Alaska, than Trump won in South Carolina. So that's a very important thing to point out. Colorado was just 1 point off from being a Kansas-type margin, to put it into perspective, and Colorado was one of the more hotly contested swing states back in 2016 and 2012. But this election, absolutely not. And moving forward, I think the Democrats are still going to have a very strong grip on that state. I also think that the Northeastern appeal isn't going to fade, especially with Donald Trump not as the nominee. That is the problem. I mean, if he runs in 2024, I think he'd lose the election, but he'd still retain a lot of support amongst the white working class. The reason why we haven't seen Republicans in the past appeal to these voters in the Rust Belt, appeal to these voters in some regions of the Sun Belt, is because they were not Donald Trump. Donald Trump tapped into a voting base that really was not tapped into by any other Republican in the past, not even George Bush. I would argue that the last Republican to actually tap into that voting base was George H.W. Bush back in 1988, and then America was a very different country than it is today. And I think Donald Trump was truly the only Republican nominee back in 2016, a Republican candidate that could have beaten Hillary Clinton. And I think in 2024, he would lose the election, but I think he'd perform better than some Republicans. But I don't think that 2024 is an automatic loss for Republicans whatsoever. There are still many opportunities for pickups. But I think Texas is going to start out as a lean state. We could see it narrow up. 2020 was a year where Texas was decided by 5.6%. That is a roughly 3.4% swing from 2016. So when you're looking at Texas, absolutely could be competitive. If it narrows down an additional 3.4%, it goes down to being a 2-point margin of victory for the Republicans if we're comparing it to 2020. So Texas, absolutely competitive. I think that Georgia would be a state that would be, a prime target for Democrats. Obviously, I mean, they won this state. I think Nebraska 2nd is actually going to move down to being lean in this election. It could revert back to its Republican identity, but that isn't the most likely scenario that I see happening, which is why I'm characterizing it as lean. I think the Republicans will hold a very narrow, and I mean that very much so, narrow edge in Maine's 2nd District. We are not seeing Republican support for any other nominee besides Trump. I don't think Pence could even come close to Donald Trump's numbers on the electoral map. So looking at Maine's 2nd District, I don't really see much hope for Republicans unless they run a Trump-like candidate, someone who can really appeal to these voters, because these are not Republican voters. These are lifelong Democratic voters that flipped in 2016 and remained in 2020. But moving past this election, it's very possible Maine 2nd District returns to being competitive, returns to being a Democratic district. But right now, I think the Republicans have the upper hand based off their 2020 electoral performance in that state and in that district specifically. But I wouldn't be too safe on that if I was a part of the Republican Party advising them on electoral areas. So right now, the Democratic potential nominee is 211, Republican 166. So like I said, I just mentioned the state of Georgia. I think this is a state that the Democratic Party is actually going to have a lean advantage entering into 2024. I understand that this election was pretty much a push away from from Trump-like Republicans, but David Perdue was far from that, and even he was under 50%. I think with a candidate that can really drive up African-American turnout the same way the Democrats did this election, and with suburban support in this specific state, I really think that the Democratic Party could turn Georgia from what was a narrow flip to being the next Virginia or being the next Colorado, because Georgia is growing in terms of its population, and the majority of this growth is from minority groups, and also in the Atlanta metro area, we're going to see a lot of support, increased support for Democrats. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of new voters by the time we reach 2024. That'll be enough to make the state start out, I would say, as lean for the Democrats, and the Democratic Party is going to funnel a lot of money here in order to remain competitive or remain in the favorable position moving forward. So Georgia, I actually would consider to be starting out as lean. I think that the state of Pennsylvania, I think the state of Wisconsin, and I think that the state of Michigan will also start out as tilt states for the Democratic Party. Their grip is weakening. Their grip is weakening in these three states. The Democratic Party will not be as solid here, especially moving forward. What we actually see is the reason why we're seeing minority growth in a lot of these Sunbelt states is because they're coming from this region. Thus, the decrease in electoral votes and the increase across the southern region. So when you see minority decrease population in Milwaukee, you see it happening in Detroit, you see it happening in a number of cities around Pennsylvania, that will reduce the electoral presence of a state, but make it in turn more Republican. So when you're looking at Wisconsin, looking at Michigan, looking at Pennsylvania, look at those major cities. Almost all of them have seen a very drastic decrease in population over the past few decades. Enough so that at this point, I think moving forward into 2024, it's going to be just as difficult for Democrats to win. Even though Donald Trump may not be the nominee, it's just the lack of voters being there. And sure, they've moved to other regions of the country, making these states more competitive in the South. But also, it does come at a price. You couldn't solidify the Rust Belt and win the South. That would be a landslide scenario, and it's technically possible. I just don't think that it's super likely. And I think that Iowa and Ohio actually will remain in the likely Republican column. I don't think that these states are going to be prime targets for Democrats, nor do I think that the Republican support is going to be significantly lost in either of these two states. So Iowa, Ohio, I think that these states could be likely. It really all depends on who the nominee is, though. But my initial rating is that these states will retain their Republican support. Maybe not 8-9%, maybe 5-6%, but that's still enough to be likely. Iowa and Ohio have shown us that even in wave years, they are immune to pushes for Democrats, statewide at least. Maybe in some of the more contested congressional districts, definitely not Ohio, given its gerrymandered performance, or map. But Iowa, maybe. But right now, the Republicans do control a lot in Iowa and Ohio, and I think moving forward, I think the Democratic Party should definitely contest it, but I don't think that it'd be a prime target for Democrats. And I think Minnesota, like I had mentioned, will be a state that starts out as lean for the Democratic Party. It's going to be a region of the country they're not going to be super solid in, but I do think that they are going to start out with the advantage. Same thing in the states of Nevada and Arizona. I think that Arizona actually would move over from tilt to lean. So Arizona and Georgia moving over a characterization, states that hadn't been Democrat, voted for the Democratic Party since 1992 for Georgia, 1996 for Arizona under Bill Clinton. So both of these states I'd initially characterize as lean for the Democratic Party. And then when you look up at the state of New Hampshire, I think this state actually retains in the likely column for the Democratic Party. But when you're looking at Florida and North Carolina, it's very tricky. It is very, very tricky. I actually think that Florida could be a state that goes lean, not likely, lean for the Republican Party as it did this election. It's going to be very difficult, very, very difficult for Democrats to win in the state of Florida moving towards the future. Looking at this state's composition in terms of minority support, you'd expect it to be a state that was very contested for the Democratic Party. Every election they try to win it, but they haven't won a statewide race in quite some time now. Not saying they should give it up. It's a very large electoral prize. It's just as competitive as Texas, but that sort of puts it into perspective. Looking at 2024, I think Florida and Texas could see a similar, voting for a Republican margin, and I think that's fascinating. But I don't think that that's necessarily the news that the Democratic Party wants to hear, specifically about Florida, specifically about the state of Texas. So right now, the Democratic would-be nominee is at 302 electoral votes. The Republicans are at 220. And I'm actually going to say, the state of North Carolina is probably going to be one of the more hotly contested states as well. We are seeing an increase in population. Like I said, likely hundreds of thousands more Democratic voters added to the voter rolls in North Carolina with its increased population and the younger population, Generation Z, being able to vote in a higher proportion in this election. This entire country is shifting to the left. I think with its minority presence in a number of these states increasing drastically, we are going to see the entire country shift to the left. If you take a look at where certain political parties stood on certain issues back in 2008, you could see very similar stances from the Democratic Party in 2008 versus the Republican Party in 2020. And the entire country is only going to continue to shift to the left as our politicians are forced to shift to the left as well. Joe Biden running on a platform in 2020 was nowhere near his platform in his previous 2 election bids. Hillary Clinton's platform in 2016 was nowhere near her platform in 2008. Barack Obama's 2008 platform would be one of the more right-wing Democrats in the 2020 Democratic primary. So when you're looking at the entirety of the country, I think that we are shifting to the left, and this election is only going to solidify that, this 2024 election. Now, I know you really didn't want to see a repeat of the 2020 electoral map, but like I always say, margins matter. Take a look at the states. We are going to see a super competitive Rust Belt region in terms of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, a super competitive Sun Belt region, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, states that were, voting the same way based off my ratings because states typically do not change. I don't think that we're going to see an exact map, but I can't exactly predict the uncertainty of the next 4 years. But I do think that we would see a very similar map. I think that states are going to get very competitive. In some of these states could expand based off how they voted. But for right now, these are my ratings for certain states. Look at Arizona, look at Georgia, look at Texas. Ratings have changed. Look at North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, ratings have changed. So that's super important. Make sure you note that. This is my way too early 2024 electoral map projection, I guess, where each state stands. It's very similar. I mean, it is the 2020 map, but like I say, margins matter, and this absolutely could change. We have 4 years to go. Who knows, right? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election playlist. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.